know we've covered 4 subjects through the fall semester of this program, and this springtime, winter and springtime, now we're going to kind of reset with this talk from Reverend Dr. Chad Lakeys on this whole topic of how not to destroy our relationships by making the issues the prominent theme of our interactions with people. And isn't that really going on so much in our culture today? We do also have one person that I want to introduce to you tonight. I had mentioned to you earlier that Concordia is one of the 15 churches in the St. Louis community that is a partner with a Christian faculty group at Washington University called the Carver Project. And the executive director is with us, Louisa Wimmer. Wave to everyone there. And we so enjoy sharing a Christian presence on Washington University campus and supporting Christian faculty there. This next year, the second half of our series, we'll be using lots of Washington University professors speaking in tandem with our professors from Concordia Seminary. So it's going to be a really wonderful interaction, I think. Well, we have a very special guest to introduce our speaker this evening, and she happens to be the birthday girl. This is a very special birthday for her. So, Beatrice Hopley, I won't say what year it is, but it's a big one.
Do you want me to use that? Okay. Thank you. And it's a big one, so no escaping reality here. I had introduced Chad the first time he was with us here in September. It is my pleasure again to introduce him to you. I used to work with him. He was my boss. And I was in charge of Hispanic ministry for Lutheran Hour Ministries for many, many years, never had a direct boss except the director of the department until they brought in Chad. And I thought, oh my. But here is a good part. Chad didn't know anything about reaching out to Hispanics in this country, but he did know very well how to let the light of Jesus shine so that I could do my work and reach out to the Hispanics with him behind me. That's the title of his book, How the Light Shines Through. We will have some on the table there for you to buy afterwards if you are willing to want to do so. But I come from a different background. You know, I'm an immigrant, I'm Hispanic, I come from South America. He's a very white American. And you don't see eye to eye many times, because we come from different cultures. In spite of all that, we worked together and my best years at LHM were with you as my boss, because he cleared the way for me. He let the light of Jesus shine on me and on our ministry together. So without talking anymore, Chad, if you would come up here to present your topic today.
Thank you.
Yep.
I don't deserve such flattery. Thank you, B.
Yes, you do.
The last time I was here, I yammered on for probably more than an hour. So tonight I'm going to try to do this in about 30 minutes. About half as much time as I usually devote to this, but hopefully that will allow us to have a bit richer of discussion. Fewer of us here tonight because perhaps of the weather outside. I've entitled this same way in the book, How Not to Let Issues Prevent Relationships. No need to take pictures. I'm happy to share my content with John, who can then distribute to anybody who's here. And I'll just start with this, 93%. 93%, that is how many of us in American society hate how divided we've become, and at the same time are frustrated and exhausted by it because we don't know what to do about it. And what are we divided about? could go through this list, but we could probably take 5 minutes and discuss and exhaust that time and still not be finished with a list of all of the things that we're divided about. And it tends to look something like this. If you can't see that little caption there, this is from the New Yorker several years ago. It says, "Your mother and I are separating because I want what's best for the country and your mother doesn't." And I use this little comic a lot, and I talk to church professionals about this topic, and so I like to sub in the word church for country. Your mother and I are separating because I want what's best for the church, and your mother doesn't. But we can interchange the relationships. It doesn't have to be husband and wife. It can be mother and son. It can be dear friends of many, many years. The question that I want to try to deal with, and I'm not sure that I fully have a good answer for, is why have we decided that we need to dissociate with one another when we disagree about issues that we hold near and dear, even sacred? We didn't have to decide that, but we did. It seems that we did. And in large part, most of us seem to operate that way. Now it feels like a social imperative, as if we have to. We have to disassociate when I run into someone who disagrees with me, who holds something sacred that I do not. It's as if I remain associated with them, I'm either guilty by association, and so the group that I'm a part of is going to ostracize me, or I'm worried from a kind of immunization perspective that they're going to infect me with their bad ideas, their false truths, however we want to put it. So to try to work through this, I don't really want to spend a lot of time in this conversation talking about them, the people that we disagree with. I want to talk about us, because I can't really do anything about them, and neither can you. I might have a little bit of power to do something about me, at least with a little bit of self-reflection, and even more so with the help of God. So I want to talk about 4 challenges and then 4 approaches about what we might do as a response to what's going on in us that's contributing to what seems to be a knee-jerk reaction to disassociate from people that we disagree with. And here are the 4. I want to talk quickly through each of them. I want to discuss ideological differences. I want to discuss reacting before understanding, assuming motivation. And those top 3, I think, are, in a sense, bad habits. And then I want to talk about something from the flip side, how the world tends to see us Christians and often the church. So first, ideological differences. I want to borrow from a great book. I'll recommend a couple tonight, not to overwhelm you. I've just found them helpful. I often feel like David Brooks, who's one of my significant influences. I read him a lot. I really appreciate him. I sometimes disagree with him. He's a New York Times columnist. He has several books. One of the things that he says, and I think he steals this from Christianity somewhere, I don't know the source of it, is, "I'm just a beggar leading other beggars to where I found bread." And when I recommend other books, I feel like, yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. I found something helpful, and I'm just trying to give it away. So Jonathan Haidt, in his really tremendous book, The Righteous Mind, that subtitle really talks to this conversation, talks about what he says are the ties that bind us together and simultaneously blind us. They bind us together and simultaneously blind us. Group identity is formed in part by shared ideas, the ties that bind. These are good things. Jonathan Haidt's not a Christian, but I think we can extend his argument to say God made the ties that bind for the sake of holding groups of people, communities, churches, or other groups of Christians together. We can simplify it. Obviously, there are ways of going political on all of these different ties that bind, shared ideas, and so on, but we can talk about Detroit Lions fans, of which I'm at least one, or people who love beer, or Taco Bell, right? You can get pretty deep in Dungeons and Dragons. You know, there are all these subcultures that are held together very similarly in very much the same way that the church is, by the ties that bind. In the church, especially in the Lutheran church, we can just name a couple of ours. The Lutheran confessions would be one. That we ascribe lordship to Jesus Christ would be another. Or if we want to broaden it and include all the many other kinds of Christians, if we want to build a big tent, we can think of basic Christian orthodoxy and go all the way back to the historic creeds. In a sense, what's the bare minimum that holds us together? Most Christians would point there. That would be the place. These are the ties that bind. They're good. They hold us together. They keep our community moving forward. But he also talks about the ties that, as I said, blind. There's a great story from maybe 30 or more years ago on the NPR radio show called Fresh Air. And the host is interviewing a man who had recently come out of a white supremacy cult. And you would imagine, if someone's describing the guest and the elements of the show to you, that you're probably going to hear something of an intellectual argument, where he starts to tick off all of the reasons why he realized white supremacy was bad, and as a result, made a rational decision to exit his association with that group. But you would be completely wrong. In fact, he tells a very affective, feelings and experiential-oriented story. He starts to talk about the fact that he was at a rally, and he was hearing a very rallying and motivating speech from the leader of the group. And the leader of the group starts to name all of the reasons that they are bound together. And one after another, yes, 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 he feels like he can get behind all of it, and everyone, the energy in the room is just increasing and increasing. And then he starts to name others within the white race. They are in some way defective. Defective in the sense that the CDC talks about birth defects. He starts to name those with certain kinds of conditions that are a curse to the white race. They, too, need to be eradicated, eliminated, erased. And as he goes through the list, he names those with the condition of cleft palate. And in that moment, everything changed for that man. His son was born with that condition. And all of a sudden, his allegiances completely shifted. Because what he didn't realize in terms of the ties that bind, because they also blind, was that his very commitments to the cult called him to be against a member of his own family. He couldn't do it. And so he left. After the fact, he started to realize then intellectually all of the reasons that maybe it had been a bad choice to become associated with this group in the first place. The ties that bind can also blind. We can get entrenched, as we seem to be, in us versus them mentalities. We can get entrenched in tribalism, where we are even within what seem to be homogenous, unified communities eating our own. Purity cults that exist even within unique church bodies are doing this. You see it on the national political stage with the fracturing of the MAGA movement currently. And we can become very easily used to thinking of anybody who is an outsider as bad or stupid or evil or going to hell or less than human, potentially worth doing violence against in order to prevent their ideas, their life, their way of life as a community from succeeding. We're witnessing some of these things currently. How do we get past this? I think there's some great wisdom in Arthur Brooks' book, Love Your Enemies. Brooks is a Catholic. He used to lead a conservative think tank called the American Enterprise Institute. He now teaches at Harvard in the School of Business and Leadership. Writes for The Atlantic on the regular. I'd really recommend listening to anything that he's done podcast-wise or reading that column. He's got another book coming out very soon. But this one was tremendous. And one of the things that he says in the book, I'll just quote him for a minute, is he says, socially what we're experiencing is a lot of contempt for one another. What I'm talking about, this knee-jerk disassociating from one or another that we disagree with, he talks about as contempt when we try to criticize other people. He says, contempt makes persuasion impossible. No one's ever been hated into agreement, after all. No one has ever been hated into agreement, after all. So its expression is either petty self-indulgence, right? We do it to feel good about ourselves, like we're righteous, and we humans do have a problem with that. Or as cheap virtue signaling, right? So all the people that we want to stay associated with and stay on the good side of think that we're doing the right thing, right? It's like waving a flag. But Brooks is very clear, neither of these wins converts. Neither of these kinds of activities makes a difference. Contempt is futile. So how do we get past ideological differences? Well, in a simple way, I think you have to treat it like a Wile E. Coyote moment. You just got to wait for it to happen. This is what happens to the member of the white supremacist cult. So if you've seen these cartoons, and I think everybody in the room here is at least roughly of age to have seen these Warner Brothers cartoons, they're very politically incorrect nowadays. So they aren't broadcast on TV. You're going to have to go look them up on YouTube or whatever. But Wile E. Coyote, it's always these little shorts. He's trying to catch the Roadrunner, and he's coming up with all kinds of really creative ways. I'm going to get him this time. And the Roadrunner, of course, is always coming up with really interesting ways of defying the plans of Wile E. Coyote. And so by the end of almost every one of these shorts, you see Wile E. Coyote coming to his doom. And many times it looks like this. The Roadrunners tricked him in their chase to running off the edge of a cliff. And it just stops right there. And the Roadrunner looks down, he looks up, he looks at you, the viewer, he looks down, and then he falls to his doom. And I think coming out of an ideology is an experience something like that. It's not one that any of us can control. We can't usually argue someone out of an ideological perspective. Sociologists, psychologists actually advise against us even trying. Because the logic, when you're caught up in an ideology, is very circular, irrational in a sense, rational internally, but irrational to most of the rest of us. We can't understand why they would think that way. And so we often are compelled, well, if I just present this evidence, can't they see? No. They just wrap you and your counter evidence into their ideology. And at the very least, they realize they can stop listening to you because you're one of the reasons that they're right in your wrongness. I think one of the only things that we can do is maintain relationship for the sake of being there when it all unravels, when it comes to an end. Because in an age when disagreement means disassociation, and ideology often means that. We've seen so much of it with conspiracy theories in the last half of a decade. Many of these people have no one left who might care for them, who might love them, who they can rely on to be there when everything in their world unravels. Someone who will still see them as more than their ideology. One of my favorite authors, John Inazu, works local here, teaches at WashU. He's a teacher in the law school, wrote a great book called Confident Pluralism, and this was his advice. Really simple, I think very concise. He says, we can't reconcile ideologies, but we can bridge relationships. People are more than what they believe or think. And so he suggests focus on bridging divides in a couple of ways, by asking what do we have in common, And in that book, he argues that we have something of a modest unity. He doesn't really go into detail about what that is, but it's quick and easy to imagine. We all want clean drinking water, access to education and health care. We don't like it when our infrastructure falls apart. And this time of the year, there's lots of potholes in the road. So we want somebody to do something about it. We might find that we like the same Netflix series, the same authors, the same kinds of food, or that we're fans of the Detroit Lions, or bands like Dream Theater, which probably only one guy in the back booth knows. But it's my favorite. When we see people as just their ideas, what they believe in, what they adhere to, we miss the whole of them. We've reduced them down and then decided because of that, we can't be friends anymore. We can't stay in touch. By focusing on what we have in common, we might sustain that relationship so that we can be there if and when that ideology unravels. And that doesn't neglect the disagreement, but I think from a Christian perspective, it really does aim to disagree better by still being there, by continuing to witness and let the light shine through you, by continuing to be a person who exhibits the love of Jesus for someone. The second challenge is reacting before understanding. I think all of us struggle at times to listen well. So in another really helpful book, Alan Jacobs, he's an English professor, teaches down at Baylor, really pretentiously titled, How to Think. Well, who are you to tell me how to come on. But the subtitle, really small there, if you can see it on the screen, A Survival Guide for a World at Odds. Okay, now you've got my attention. So when I started to read it, I found it again to be really helpful. And one of the things he talks about there is what he calls refutation mode. And it's something like this. You're in an event of just this sort with a speaker like me yapping at you about something that you find disgusting. Right? Something you absolutely disagree with. I've said something that's offended you, and all of a sudden your blood pressure goes up. And somehow, some biological, physiological way, it shuts our ears. We stop listening, and we start to think of all the ways that we're going to torpedo that person's argument when they finally stop talking. At Q&A, I'm really going to get them. Could be on a podcast. It could be as we're watching two talking heads on any of the mainstream news networks. Could be reading a book or a column. We stop paying attention. We stop listening and all the various ways that we could do that. So the challenge is we may miss the fact that, well, that person was actually giving a counterexample to the ultimate conclusion they wanted to end up with. You missed it because you stopped. And he advises something simple. Try listening fully. Try listening fully. This takes discipline and patience. And he says, but give it 10 minutes. What happens in that 10 minutes? That physiological, that biological reaction tends to calm down. In the exact same way that when we're raising small children, we often invite them to take a breath. And in moments when they see us frustrated, they repeat it back to us. Mom, Dad, maybe you should take a deep breath. You know, it's embarrassing, it's right, you got me. Maybe makes me want to holler some more. But it's right. There's something right about that. It acknowledges part of how we've all been made. And so I think Jacobs is really on the money here. He's borrowing also a little bit from some work in Jonathan Haidt's book that I can go into maybe in the Q&A if you want to hear a little bit more about that. But I also want to push from here into some ideas that I think are just flowing through his book as taken for granted background assumptions that he doesn't fully articulate. Jacobs is a Christian, and he's really coming from a perspective that I think is quite Christian. So one of the things that he is talking about is that we should practice listening in order to understand, first and foremost, before reacting or responding. Or in another way, he's suggesting we should practice what many in the Christian tradition have called intellectual humility, and that's just the realization that I am a finite human being, I don't know everything, and I may even have something to learn from someone that I don't necessarily agree with, and maybe as a result of that, don't really want to listen to, maybe because I feel like I don't like them, I'm afraid that they might infect me somehow or mislead me. Intellectual humility, I think, opens us. It makes us just a little bit more generous, and it tempers our own egos just a little bit. I think it's really helpful, and he's drawing, as he kind of works these assumptions through the book, on part of the classic Christian tradition. This famous Latin phrase, credo ut intelligam, said in different ways by Augustine and Anselm, comes out to be something like this: I believe in order to understand. Our starting point as human beings is to realize I don't know everything. In fact, all that there is to know, I'll never even get close to plumbing those full depths. But as God has sent the Holy Spirit to lead us into all truth, as the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, coming to understand ourselves and the way that the world is a grand adventure that God's invited us to be a part of. And so we start by believing and trusting in God. And the next step is, as we study and learn more, we come to understand. And I think that's deep in the mix of Jacob's argument. The third challenge that we face, I think, is we're quick to assume motivation. Psychologists and sociologists name this motivation, attribution, asymmetry. And it works kind of like this. We tend to think of those whom we disagree with as if they are worse sorts of people, less intelligent, vile, not to be associated with. On the other hand, we tend to imagine ourselves as well-intentioned, rational, and on the side of righteousness. Well, good job, us, right? But the trouble with assumptions, you already know what that is. We don't have to say it. We're in a church. Okay, but we all know what the problem with assumptions is. We could characterize it differently than the cliche. It misconstrues reality very often. It tends to damage relationships. If you are someone who habitually makes assumptions about the wrongness or the less intelligence or the vileness of another person, it can generate situations in which your very character is called into question. It exhibits what Brooks called contempt. It's straight contemptuous. It's as if you already know better. But overall, assumptions are unproductive. We don't know where another person is coming from, what they really think, how they arrived at the conclusions that they've arrived at. There's no way of really moving anything forward and trying to solve the disagreement that we're embedded in. The fourth thing I want to talk about quickly is this challenge that comes at us in a different direction. Not so much from our own bad habits internally or struggling with how to work through ideology, but the fact that the world tends to see the church now from a perspective of antagonism. In other words, sometimes cliches are cliches because they're true. We're known more for what we're against than what we're for. You may have heard that many, many times. Maybe it's the first time. Some people dismiss it. It's just a cliche. I've heard that before. Not worth listening to, but I really think that it is. If we care about our witness, we should pay attention to our reputation. We are who we have been before the eyes of the watching world. We are who we have been before the eyes of the watching world. The world consistently sees us as being against a great deal and very inarticulate about what we are for. And so we've got to ask, is this the witness that we want? I suspect you're here, that your answer would be no. That's not the witness that I want. So what can we do? I'm going to try to deal with this in one slide, and then maybe over the conversation we can go through a little bit more. But just to reiterate through these 4 points, how do we not let issues prevent relationships? I think we can try to approach this from the perspective of our social reputation as Christians or as the church in general. We can aim to be known for our love. Why do I suggest this? Because for me, it's reaching back into the reputation of the early church. There are several really helpful books that chart out the fact that the early church was known for its patience. There's Tertullian, the North African theologian, who talked about the fact that the church's reputation was see how they love one another, see how they're willing even to die for one another, which stood in stark contrast to the culture in which these Christians were embedded. We can go to the so-called anonymous letter to Diognetus. We don't know who wrote it, what the purpose was, but there, roughly same time period as Tertullian's comments, a beautiful description of the difference of the church compared to the world. This set up for them a reputation that by the time Constantine the Great was leader of all over the Roman Empire, he sat up and paid attention to what was going on with the Christians. And it changed everything for the Western world. Christianity was no longer persecuted. It became a valid religion of the empire. It was the reputation they took several centuries to build that changed everything. That's made it very easy for us to be Christians, despite the fact that you're probably here because you don't feel like it's very easy. I promise you, my friends, it's much easier than what they had to struggle with. None of us risks our life on a daily basis for being followers of Jesus. Aim to be Christians who are known for their love. We can't go back to those days, but we can lean back on that wisdom for the sake of moving forward. Anyway, God is already always pulling us forward. We're on an eschatological trajectory. He's drawing us always toward the end that he's preordained for himself, the consummation of all things, the return of Jesus, the promise of eternity with him. So let me reiterate responses to some of the challenges. I encourage you to seek to bridge relationships, and I tried really briefly to give you a sense of how you might imagine yourself doing that. Focus on the things that you have in common. It doesn't neglect the disagreement, but it aims to disagree better, especially with Christian motivation. Take the time to truly listen. One of the outcomes is that it humanizes the other person. Another outcome is they might possibly reciprocate. Daryl Davis is a Black musician, historian, speaker. He's got a great documentary on Netflix called Accidental Courtesy. He tells the story of how he befriends white supremacists, members of the Ku Klux Klan and other groups. And one of the things that he does is sits down with them and says, "How can you hate me when you don't even know me?" And that begins a conversation. And he goes on from there to say, "I never set out to convert any of these people, but over the period of the relationship, some of them ended up converting themselves." That is, they left that life and that association with white supremacy behind because they began to see this black man as not just symbolic of something terrible according to their ideology, but as a full human being, just like themselves. You take the time to truly listen, it humanizes the other person. We learn a great deal from them. They might also reciprocate, giving you a chance to explain to them how you've come to your conclusions, where you're coming from, what you're interested in, what you love, what you hold sacred, most near and dear. Take St. Paul's advice. Refrain from assuming motivation. If you're going to assume anything, assume something about yourself, that you are less than everybody else around you. Take the attitude of Jesus. That's where he's encouraging us with this. Jesus said, Godhood is nothing for me to hold on to. If it means letting it go is going to end up bringing about salvation for all of them. All of them who have hated me, all of them who haven't recognized me when I appeared, all of them who are blind to me because of the darkness they live in. Paul says, assume so much more about them in terms of their worth, in terms of their dignity, in terms of their time, but not in terms of their motivation, their sinfulness, and so on. And finally, I think the church has to find ways to narrate how we are for others. Instead of what we're against, we should narrate what we are for. One of the ways that I like to do this super quickly in the book is to smash together the words of St. Paul and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer famously called Jesus the quintessential man for others. St. Paul in Galatians chapter 2 said, "It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." If the man for others is the one that lives in you and me, that makes us people for others. It's a super short definition of the church. This is how to understand who we are. We are people for others, and we have to find ways to narrate that, exhibit it, practice it, right? Live it out, just as Jesus said in John 6 that he has came not for himself, but for the life of the world. And so I'll end with this. I think we can learn from Jesus. All through the Gospels, and the way that he's talked about in the New Testament, we see that he never let an issue prevent a relationship. He was stern with the stubborn Pharisees. He pushed back on someone like the woman at the well. Invite your husband. I have no husband, sir. You're right that you have no husband. You've actually had 5, but the one that you're with is not your husband. What? Who are you? Right? It was revelatory. He used those moments of pushback for the sake of potentially opening them up to seeing who he truly was. Even more so, I think it's important to recognize that if there's anybody that deserves to be cut off from Jesus, it's me and you. But he didn't. He didn't. In fact, while we were still his enemies, he died for us. And because of that, because we are able on a daily basis to reflect on and take in that truth, that we are loved when we don't deserve it, well, that experience in and of itself is something that the Holy Spirit can use to take us forward into relationships that seem impossible. How can I love this person when we so disagree? I think Jesus shows us the way. I think he shows us the way. Thanks very much.
If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll get a mic to you and go ahead and get this started. Maybe just to stimulate some thought, I find myself in relationship with CNN or Fox News, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And sadly, oftentimes, as a substitute for a relationship with a friend or someone else. What is your suggestions about how to deal with that information that we're taking in from an internet or from news or, because I tend to get real angry, and particularly if it's something that I disagree with. And so that's sort of a silly interaction with an electronic instrument somewhere. But what would you have to say to that?
Yeah, a couple of things. There is a phrase that the journalist Monica Guzman uses. People who are underrepresented in your life are overrepresented in your imagination. People who are underrepresented in your life are overrepresented in your imagination. And I think the media environment in which we're immersed in constantly exposes us to people and ideas that are an abstraction. We have no embodied connection to them. So they become an idea, a label, very easily a them, a less than human very often because of how they're portrayed and construed. And so we fall into that trap of what Guzman is trying to, I think, get us to wrestle with internally. We don't see them as fully human. We've overrepresented them in our imagination as, well, in terms of that motivation, attribution, asymmetry, vile, unintelligent, what have you. I think the challenge of overcoming that is exactly what you're talking about. I tend to spend more time here and less with embodied people. The discipline is going to be what God calls us to. Spend time with flesh and blood people. Not for the sake of convincing them or changing their mind, just to get to know them. Be curious. When they start to talk about something that you radically disagree with, keep going. How did you come to that conclusion? Help me understand how you worked your way to this sort of end. What makes you so confident about this? And as you listen, and you listen, and you listen, you start to see more of them as a person. You're probably going to get their background story, their experiences, and it's going to start to make sense to you. Like, I don't have that experience. I'm finding it difficult to relate, but as you tell your story, I'm understanding more and more how you could come to that conclusion, how you could have that view, how you could support this person, how you could think that what I believe as a Christian is not true. But in seeing them more and more in their full humanity, I think that also opens up that space for reciprocation, where it feels good to be listened to. It feels good to be seen and fully acknowledged. And when you realize, gosh, I've been the only one talking this whole time. Tell me about you. You'd be really, I think, surprised and fascinated to see how often that would happen. I always am moved by people who are good listeners. A handful of people who have had me on podcasts and interviewed me, I've never had the chance to reciprocate. But after the fact, I'm like, dang, they ask good questions. And it moves me to want to know more about them, but, well, it was an appointment, essentially. There was a beginning and an end, and the time was over. It's fascinating how it works. And I think that's just because God made human relationships to be that way. Other questions?
But there are certainly black and white issues, right? I mean, I think you're not suggesting that we all hold hands and, sing Kumbaya, right? So how do you respond to someone that, hey, that's a really core belief, I know that's right, so how do you respond to something like that?
I think God calls us never to stop trying for the sake of the relationship, for the sake of the person. Never to cut off the opportunity that they might actually meet Jesus in us. They can cut us off. They can walk away, they can shake the dust off of their feet, they can abandon the relationship with us, and I can't do anything about that. What I'm in charge of and what I think we are accountable to is to do what we see Jesus doing. He's always going toward. He's always coming down out of heaven for the sake of relationship with us. We're called to do the same, despite even the black and the white.
But even Jesus, at the temple, he threw the tax or the merchants out, right? He got very angry. And so that would maybe go against what you are advocating.
In Luke 15, we've got the story of the prodigal son. Classic. People love it. They see themselves in it, right? I'm the lost one that the father welcomes back. I think we miss a more holistic interpretation of that story if we don't read the beginning of Luke 15. At Jesus' feet are two audiences: tax collectors and sinners, religious officials and scribes. And so as Jesus gets to that parable, he makes up two images representative of those audiences. And by the end of the parable, we all know and we love and we celebrate that the prodigal, who had squandered all of the gifts of God, has been welcomed back nevertheless. We see and hear the story of the older son who's upset. Dad, how could you do that? He was so offensive to you. He basically wished you dead by asking for his portion of the inheritance, right? A social faux pas beyond social faux pas. How could you accept someone back after that? It's horrible. It's the worst possible thing. And the father says to his son, you know, son, everything I have is yours. It always has been. And he's speaking in that moment to the religious officials who had neglected doing their job, which was giving away this grace of God for a very long time. I think when we reflect on that parable, we don't spend enough time wondering how it actually ends. The older son is invited into the party. There's nothing in the text that says what actually happens. Does he go? Doesn't he go? But I think the father is always standing like this to both the prodigal and the older son. They were both lost. And he stands with open arms to those that he kicked out of the temple, to the Pharisees, where in the end of Matthew, the end of Luke, he's condemning and saying, woe to you, for the sake of the possibility that they might come to know him as he is, accept him as he is, believe him and trust him as he is. Our Lutheran confessions, I think, also do the same. They stand up for what they believe was right. But very clearly in the preface to almost every document is an openness to working things out. They're not cutting off the relationship. They were cut off from the church in their excommunication.
So, but certainly Luther says, here I stand. You wouldn't try to get him to change his mind and say, well, don't say it like that. And you know, for Bonhoeffer, I mean, he took very hard stands against things that he thought were extremely wrong. And that's the confusion I have from you, is that I hear you saying, well, don't come at him so hard on issues. You know, maybe we can get them to change their minds. And yet I think in history there are certainly situations where that was definitely wrong. Mm-hmm.
Well, so if we want to talk about Luther, Luther said, here I stand. But before that, he said, convince me by Scripture. He wasn't closed. If you read about Bonhoeffer's life, he struggled deeply with the decisions that he made. Incredibly deeply. Jeffrey Pugh's book called Religionless Christianity really works that out, how he struggled through that, especially from the very Lutheran Pauline tradition that he was a part of. He wasn't sure all the time that what he was doing was right, because I think he had a deeply felt sense of his own fallibility, his own finiteness, his own humanity, his own sinfulness, and how shot through everything that sin is, it generated for him this sense of uncertainty, being unsure of how he should act, despite the fact that he did make a decision, he made it boldly, and he thought it was the most faithful. He nevertheless remained open to be corrected. He submitted himself to the fact that I'm not the judge of me, God is. Luther too, we've got to do the same. What I'm pushing is different. It's difficult. But here I am standing up here saying something boldly. I think it's true. I think it's right. Nevertheless, I remain open, like, well, keep pushing back on me, but I don't think you've got me there yet. You feel me? Others over here, B.
I hope I phrase this correctly, but based on what you're saying, and I've run into situations like this in my personal life too. Several years ago, we were in Philadelphia, and we were at my niece's wedding, and afterwards we were down in the bar, and I was talking to a gentleman. Lisa was with me, and he was from Europe, and he overheard Lisa, one of our conversations, and he said, "Oh, you're one of them."
Because we're from Missouri.
Because you're from Missouri, you're one of them. You're like them, okay? And I.
A red state.
You're a red state, okay? So, and he automatically assumed that we were all like that, right? So as we were having this conversation, he was a lot more from a liberal persuasion than I am. But during the conversation, and at the end of the conversation, which lasted probably 30 minutes to 45 minutes, we found out that we had much more in common than either of us believed at the beginning. And so I take it to heart what you're saying, and the gentleman over here is saying, well, ideologically, no, I'm not going to change that person's mind, so let's not go there. Let's find out what we are most common about. And I think what most people will find is that we are a lot more common in a lot more areas than we're not. Is that kind of what you're leading to?
Yes, I think it's possible that you will discover those things. I do also think it's very real that there is polarization amongst us, substantial. But there are several really great journalistic books that walk through stories of just that sort. So I'm thinking of Amanda Ripley's book. It's going to come to me as I try to type this. I know it is. High conflict. High conflict. I recommend it. John Anazu does this in his book too. So John Anazu is a scholar of the part of the First Amendment, the right to assembly. And so his book, Confident Pluralism, he starts off with a great introduction in chapter 1, and then he goes into sort of his legal scholarship, which academics have to do. It's accessible, published by the University of Chicago, so really great, reputable book. He worked on it at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at UVA, so just really a tremendous project. But I ended up using it for college students when I used to teach at a university, and I mostly had them read the introduction and chapter 1, and then the last 5 to 8, the back half of the book. Because then he starts to go through stories, and he talks about relationships of groups of people who are from very polar opposite perspectives, who actually come together and start working on things in common, right? On issues of abortion, on issues of pornography, on several other things. Amanda Ripley tells very similar stories. That's why I brought up Daryl Davis. All of these things that we wouldn't imagine, like, why would these people, like, these two things don't go together, right? It's like oil and water. We would just assume that they would not be intermingling. But I think we need these sorts of stories to hit our imagination, because then that triggers our empathy. This is also why novels and literature tend to work to shape us as well. When we see stories, it shapes our imagination. We begin to realize, oh, what I thought was impossible isn't actually so impossible. Right? You experienced it. How has that made a difference in how you interact with others and the assumptions that you make about others? Has it slowed you down in making them? I hope so. I hope it's done the same for that gentleman. The other thing that I want to say in a response to that, and so this is kind of a long one. So the last presentation I talked about Charles Taylor, a really influential philosopher that's helped shape my thought a lot. And one of the things he talks about there is that as in our very pluralistic age, when we're exposed to other people who think radically different than us, one of the things that generates within us a worry, a fear, about the truth of our own deepest convictions, usually our religion, usually our faith, is being exposed to somebody who believes differently, but not just exposed to them, in deep relationship with them. So I often try to use this analogy. So I used to work out in the Pacific Northwest. That was where the university was that I taught. And it's often called the Silicon Forest. Intel works up there, so very similar to the high-tech industry in Silicon Valley. So imagine you're a software engineer, and you're put on a team to solve this really big problem. And a member of your team's a new guy in town, just coming in, brought his family, they're looking for a house. He's from India, he's a Hindu, you're a Christian, lived there in the Pacific Northwest your whole life, and what you find out is both of you so deeply love your work. You love it so much it doesn't feel like work. Every day, you're just energized to go in and work on these projects, and you're both super excited to be on this team and the problem that you've been tasked to solve with several others. And as you spend time together, you start to find out that not only do you love the work that you do, but you and your wives both binge the same Netflix series the weekend before. And he's a fan of the Seattle Seahawks too, because, well, that's the only team to be a fan of out in the Northwest. And he loves beer. In fact, he's tried brewing beer, and that brings up the fact that, you know what, I've got all of these dusty tools and pots and kettles and all of that. I tried my hand at brewing beer too. Maybe we should get together. Finally, they find a place to live. And you know where it happens to be? Your neighborhood, kitty corner across the backyard. And as you get to know the family, you realize, oh my gosh, his daughter is in my daughter's class at school, and they've gotten super close. And as this relationship grows and grows tighter and tighter, you realize the only difference between you is the fact that they go to temple on the weekend and you go to church. And that raises the possibility of this question: why my way and not his or hers? That's what Taylor calls the fragility of faith, and he narrates it that way to explain that's how it happens. It's often not intellectual at all. It's experiential, it's affective, it's relational. I think the most interesting thing about that is it's very likely that while you might wonder, why am I away and not his or hers, they're wondering the same thing about you. They're wondering the same thing about you. And that is an open space for winsome witness. How's it going to work? Not your problem. Be faithful. The Holy Spirit is the one who's at work. Right? So I think your example made both of those things go off in my head. I hope that's helpful. It's a little bit yammering on. Let's move on to the next question, please.
While I was going to seminary, I was trained as a chaplain, and one of the things I had to really work on, and I'm still working on today, is how to listen with the love of Christ, and how to set aside your own judgments and the way you perceive others. And then right after I graduated, I was assigned to inner city nursing homes here in St. Louis, one on the Hill and one in North St. Louis. And in a nursing home, people feel like they've been abandoned. You know, they don't have many visitors. They can't go out. They say, well, what did I do wrong? You know, I'm in prison. I can't control my life anymore. So I had to learn to appreciate people's feelings and really read their emotions and how to listen with your heart, how to listen with your feelings. And that was very, very helpful. And then after 6 years, I was transferred to the county jail. And there, it's all about how can they manipulate me to get what they want. And they're smart, and they know how to read you like nobody else. And a lot of them know the scriptures inside and out. They know them better than me. I could sit in a class and say, hey, I'm thinking of this verse. Where is it? Oh, it's in Romans chapter 8, you know. But, you know, they all have other agendas, and that they all are co-occurring mental illness and some kind of addiction. So when they get out, they go right back to it. Or you're dealing with the worst, most dangerous people in St. Louis, and they make the news. So you again learn to just be there, knowing that, you know, you are not responsible for changing that person. It's Jesus. And every day when I went into work, I said, Jesus, if you don't send your spirit so that I can set myself aside and let you work through me, I might as well go home and go to sleep, because it's not worth it.
Thank you for those comments. I really appreciate it. I think they're exactly right on.
Just one quick question. I was wondering if you had any good resources for children and teens to teach them about these strategies that you've talked about.
Off the top of my head, I don't. I've talked to children and not children, but teens. And I often take this title of my presentation and use the content of chapter 9 from my book, where I talk there about what I call category mistakes. But essentially, it's ways that we tend to think that end up being barriers for relationship. So it's just cultural assumptions that are out there in the water. We don't know that we're thinking with them because we never think about them. So one of them is this assumption that, you know, love equals affirmation. Disagreement equals hate, right? Those are correlated. Another assumption that I've kind of brought up here is people equal their ideas. Another one is support equals advocacy, or the exploration of an idea equals endorsement. I think they're all based on a little bit of fear or basic human desire, right? Everybody wants to be loved, right? So it's really simple to think or to feel as if when you don't fully affirm everything about me, something I think, something I do, decision I made, et cetera, then you don't really love me. Or that when you disagree, right, the corollary that you hate. So I try to work that out with students, and I've only ever done that in public presentations, really at the youth gathering and a couple local things here and there. But I don't really know of anything for young people. They tend not to be my audience as often. Sorry. So, yeah, I mean, like, it's taken me a long time, I guess, to develop these perspectives well enough to be able to articulate them. And that's kind of the stage that I'm at. And as you hear them, it probably feels foreign and like a complete paradigm shift and difficult to grasp. It's like being Neo in the Matrix and then realizing the Matrix is not real, right? His reaction to that isn't mental anguish, like it's physiological. He throws up. Coming around to all this is, I know that I'm presenting something that's challenging. But I don't think it's unbiblical or unreasonable. And I also don't think it's impossible. Not with the power of the Holy Spirit that God has promised to us. And I've experienced it, and you've experienced, and other people have probably experienced it. Yeah. Hope that helps. Next, any other questions?
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Chad.
Thank you so much,
Greatly
everyone, for your
appreciate it.
attention.
By the way, John and Azu will be with us in a couple months, so we're looking forward to that as well. You have questionnaires that you received when you came in. Please fill those out. They are extremely helpful to us as we continue to plan our programming, and there's a place to alongside the refreshments there. Just wanted to remind everybody of the upcoming topics. In February, Pastor Gerard Bowling will be with us to talk about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but what that means within our church body. The following month, Pastor Will Fredstrom from Indiana is going to be with us. He's an expert on artificial intelligence, and particularly as it relates to the church, to ministry, sermon preparation, all of those various aspects. But I think it's going to be a really wonderful discussion. And then in April, John Anazu from Washington University, John Butterfield, the principal at Lutheran South, and Reverend Chris Summers, the wellness coordinator for Lutheran South, are going to be with us to talk in a similar line to what Chad has shared with us. I think very fascinating. And then finally, to conclude this spring, Jim Marriott is going to be with us. He's now the chairman of the religion department at Concordia Austin, and obviously was the music director for Concordia Seminary, and also our traditional worship leader here at Concordia. But he's going to be with us with our worship arts team. We're going to talk about diversity in worship. I don't know that that's particularly controversial these days, but I think to explore the various aspects of sort of traditional and contemporary worship will be of help. Once again, Chad has books. He'll be out at the table in the back, right behind the refreshment table, and I think there for conversation with you as well. Any other questions? Great. Sounds like the rain has finally stopped a bit. So let's go ahead and conclude with Luther's evening prayer. Together, I thank you, my Heavenly Father, through Jesus Christ, your dear Son, that you have graciously kept me this day. And I pray that you would forgive me all of my sins where I have done wrong, and graciously keep me this night. For into your hands I commend myself, my body and soul, and all things. Let your holy angel be with me, that the evil foe may have no power over me. Amen. Go in peace and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God. Thank you.